So you want to create a portfolio or some sort of creative websites, but you're not sure if you should be using GSAP or frame of motion with React. And as a developer who works on animations at an agency and in freelance, I kind of know that both of those libraries have their own strength. And so I've made a list of the pros and cons of both of those libraries. And I want to start with GSAP, which is arguably the most popular library in the world of creative development on the web. The first thing that I love about GSAP is how powerful it is. All right, you can almost create any kind of animations with that. It has built-in super nice modules like text split, text randomization, and morphing, and some crazy things like that. For example, if you have a client that is asking for some crazy animations and you don't have that much experience with animations, then you can be sure that GSAP has your back and it can help you basically save money. However, all of the animations that are inside of the modules or like the built-in tools that GSAP offers are nothing that you can't do it yourself. So it's an advantage, but at the same time, if you're experienced, all of those things can be done by yourself. And also for a lot of them, you have to pay money. So that's a small downside on that side too. However, the best thing about GSAP is that it's versatile. It's a library that can be used with any framework. All right, that's something that's really important. And that's why, in my opinion, it's a must-learn tool. Like, as much as I talk about React, the reality is sometimes I have to use frameworks like Vue.js or Astro.js, and frame of motion simply does not work in those frameworks. And so because of that, GSAP is just a must-learn tool. So overall, GSAP is just a much more mature library than frame of motion, and it has a decent implementation with most of the frameworks that are out there. Another advantage that I find about GSAP over frame of motion is the community. And the reason why the community is just much more better than frame of motion is because it's much older. All right, frame of motion is so new that you want to Google your problem, and honestly, you won't find much resource about it compared to GSAP. Like, I remember when I was trying, like at first, to learn GSAP when I was a beginner, I could find basically all the solutions to my problems online. There was a guy talking about his problem in the forum, and I could relate with his problem, and I could basically find a solution to any problem that I had. And that's just so awesome because of that. And even for complex animations, like I remember I was trying to create like an infinite scroll, something very, very specific, and I found some guy on the forum that had this exact similar problem. And so I think the community for GSAP is a massive advantage over frame of motion. And lastly, another thing that I can see GSAP winning over frame of motion is if you're trying to make something which is very rare in my own experience, and that is a sequenced animation. All right, if you have some kind of animation that you're trying to make, like a step-by-step animation that has multiple steps, frame of motion is not really good for that. It doesn't have a built-in tool, but GSAP has something called a timeline, and there's just nothing that compared to that inside of frame of motion. The timeline is just an absolute crazy tool inside of GSAP that is really nice. But to be honest, I don't really use it a lot. I do use the timeline from time to time because it's a nice module, it's a nice object to use, but I rarely do some kind of like sequenced and super complex animations. So even though it's an advantage for GSAP, it's not something that I use a lot in my own experience, but it's definitely something that has its advantage over frame of motion. And now let's talk about the biggest problem with GSAP, and it's when you're trying to use it with React, it is just not seamless. It will work. I'm not saying it doesn't work, but you'll see you have to try it for yourself. You have some extra steps to do that make the process of development or like the development experience not that nice. You have to take extra steps, do things like use the use React hook, make sure you clean up your animation behind you, make sure you avoid FOC or flashes of content, things like that you just don't have to think about while using frame of motion. Like all of those concepts are just non-existent while using frame of motion. And that's because frame of motion has been made to be used with React. And so that's why it's much more smooth. And that leads me to the first advantage of frame of motion over GSAP while using React, and that is its declarative approach. As you may know, React is a functional library with a declarative approach. And so frame of motion, since it's been made for React, has also been made with a declarative approach. And so the connection between them is much more smooth. And overall, the architecture just makes much more sense than when using GSAP. Because while you're using GSAP, you have to start thinking imperatively, and then you use React, which is declarative. And so to me, that's a bit weird. And I understand why GSAP is imperative. That's because, well, JavaScript has like this class-based approach when you use frameworks like Astro or Vue.js. And so it makes a lot of sense to use GSAP with those frameworks. But with React, it makes a bit less sense in my opinion. However, a declarative approach brings a small problem when making animations in React, and that is a performance problem. All right, since most of the time when you want to dynamically change the visual of things inside of a React app, you need to change the state, and that way it updates the shadow DOM. All of that is good and well, but when creating an animation that updates, for example, at every single frame, like in a request animation frame, it can be very bad for performance. But FrameMotion thought about that problem and they created something called a motion value. And the motion value is also based on the state, but it's really smart. The state is internal. And so when you update, for example, a next position using a motion value, it's not going to re-render your whole component. It's only going to re-render the part of your component which is using that motion value. And so it's really smart and it can help with performance. And there's another thing that I love about FrameMotion, and it's the Animate presence. All right. Even though GSAP has a lot of plugins, it doesn't have anything that compares to that. It's something that we use in FrameMotion to animate when a component enters and leaves the DOM. For example, when you're changing page, there's like your whole page is leaving the DOM and then there's a new page that's coming inside of the DOM. Then you can use the Animate presence to animate the transition between two pages. Another case where you would use that Animate presence is, for example, you have a to-do list and then you add a new item and then you have a new item added to the DOM and then you want to remove the item, then you remove it from the DOM. Then that animation while it's being removed or added will be made automatically. If you have to do this using vanilla JavaScript, it's going to be quite a pain in the ass compared to FrameMotion and React while using the Animate presence. And now there's another thing that I love about FrameMotion, but it's quite subjective, and that it's a small library. The amount of plugins inside of GSAP is a huge advantage. But weirdly enough, the fact that FrameMotion is really simple and has really a small set of tools make it weirdly enough an advantage. Like I think I'm using about 5 to 8 different functions or tools inside of the FrameMotion library in some sort of combination. And since there's not a lot of way to do things, I kind of have to think for myself when I'm trying to make something new. And since I have like a very small set of tool, like I need to think outside the box with those tools. And honestly, it helped me as a developer to be better. I genuinely think it made me overall a better developer, because if I have to make something like a text shuffle, which would be available inside of GSAP as a plugin, now in FrameMotion, I need to figure out that thing for myself. And so I have to think about a way of doing this. And this process, this thought process of making some animations that are already inside of GSAP, since it's not inside of FrameMotion, that process really helped me develop myself and think about how animations are made. And now I think because of that, I'm just a better programmer overall. And now because of that, I'm not dependent on the plugins of GSAP. And so for example, if I have a freelance project and the code owner tells me, hey, we don't use GSAP, then I'm not panicking that I can't do my animations, because now I know what's happening behind the plugins because I had to make them myself inside of FrameMotion. And so I'm not dependent on them. I'm a better developer overall. So weirdly enough, even though FrameMotion is a small library, it's just an advantage. But if the tools are there and if GSAP is installed, then great. I can save some time, save some money. And if it's not there, then no problem. I'll do it myself. And that's what leads me to the biggest problem of FrameMotion, is that it's not a complete animation library. And what I mean by that is it gives you the bare bones and the skeleton and some very simple tools to make animations. And then it's like, okay, you manage it. You figure it out for yourself. I'm not going to help you more than that. And on the other side, GSAP is just much more complete. And if you're trying to make like a text shuffle or like a text split, you can probably make these animations twice as fast inside of GSAP compared to FrameMotion, because it's just much more of a complete library, which offers a bunch of different modules that are pre-built. And it's just like such a complete animation library. They thought about every single problem already. And so if you have those problems, you can just Google it, find it on GSAP. It's going to help you save a lot of time. So yeah, that was my list of my pros and cons of FrameMotion and GSAP. And I believe at the end of the day, you should be learning both, because both are different tools and can be used in different contexts. And so at the end of the day, I think both should be learned. But personally, if I have to choose, I would choose FrameMotion inside of a React project. And of course, if I have to use something outside of React, something like Astro, Vue.js, whatever, even vanilla JavaScript, then I can also use GSAP because I've learned it. And so my advice to you is to just learn both. And if you're focused on React, then learn Framemotion first because it fits simply better with it. So yeah, if you learned something, leave a like and I'll see you in the next one.